Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar this evening. I am Dottie Head. I'm the Director of Communications for Georgia Audubon. It's our pleasure to host this webinar this evening. We have some special guests with us this evening, and they're going to walk us through this proposal. We have Brian Gist with the Southern Environmental Law Center, Charles McMillan with the Georgia Conservancy, Abby Sterling with Manomet, and Adam Betchell with Georgia Audubon. So this is just a quick agenda. We hope to be done within about an hour. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we will do our best to get to those questions. We're probably going to move through the presentation first, and then we'll take questions at the end. So I'll get us started and turn it over to Brian, who's going to kick us off.
Everyone, my name is Brian Gist. I'm with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I've been working on this project for several years now, and I want to give you sort of the big picture of what this project is about, what some of the key concerns are, and where we are in the regulatory process reviewing this project. So Spaceport Camden would be a rocket launch facility similar to Cape Canaveral or something that you see in the movies, where you would be launching rockets, primarily small rockets, into space. It would be located right where the Satilla River runs into the intercoastal waterway. It's basically due west of Cumberland and Little Cumberland Island. The site has a long history of industrial uses. It was used to manufacture pesticides and munitions and other things over the years, and so there's known hazardous waste on the site. But right now there's nothing built there. So several years back, Camden County decided that they wanted to get into the space rocket launch business. So they applied with the Federal Aviation Administration for a license to open a new rocket launch facility. And when the FAA evaluates a proposal like this, there are really two tracks. So on the one hand, you have the FAA's rocket safety track, where they look at whether this site is a safe location, whether they deem the site to be a safe location for launching rockets. The second track is an environmental review, and that track really encompasses a lot of different things. The primary statute, the one that everyone talks about, is the National Environmental Policy Act. And this is a statute that applies to all federal actions, and it requires agencies to consider the environmental effects of agency decisions, which in this case would be issuing the license to open this facility. But as part of that review, they also have to look at a number of other federal statutes. So the Endangered Species Act, maybe the Clean Water Act, Historic Preservation Act, all other federal statutes that have to be considered as part of this process are kind of rolled up into that one document. So in evaluating this project in 2018, the FAA began their environmental review process, and they issued a document called a draft environmental impact statement. And this document is supposed to consider all the environmental effects of operating this facility. And so that document was released, and the public had the opportunity to comment on it. Also, as part of that same process, there's also an opportunity for the state to weigh in under what's called the coastal consistency process. And this is basically an opportunity before the federal government makes a decision to issue a license or issue a permit. It gives the state the opportunity to look at that project and to tell the federal agency, we believe that this is consistent or inconsistent with our coastal plans. So this is kind of a subset of that environmental review project, that environmental review process, and that's the point in this process where we are right now. So right now, the Georgia Coastal Resources Division is doing their coastal consistency review, and they're deciding whether to tell the Federal Aviation Administration whether we believe this project is consistent with our coastal plans or is inconsistent with our coastal plans. So I mentioned that there was a draft environmental review that was released in 2018. subsequent to that, as the FAA was going down the second track and reviewing the safety of this project, it became pretty clear that what they were currently proposing at that time, which was to launch medium-large rockets, was not going to meet the FAA's safety requirements. They have a variety of kind of modeling and other calculations that they perform, and when they reviewed those, it became pretty clear they weren't going to be able to make the numbers work. So Camden County came back, and at the end of 2019, early 2020, they decided to change the scope of this project. So instead of focusing on medium-large rockets, they would focus just on small rockets. Now, when I tell you they shifted from medium-large to small, you may think that's a good thing. And in some ways, maybe it is. But there's really a trade-off. You have the larger rockets have more fuel. They have they're larger in size. There's more metal that you're shooting up into the air. But they're also more stable rockets, and they have a longer track record of being successfully launched. So by shifting from medium-large to small rockets, you're trading, you're getting a smaller vehicle and less fuel, less metal that goes with it, but also a rocket that's more unstable and is more prone to failure. And so when the FAA did the environmental review, and then they came out and Camden County decided to change the focus of the project to a different category of rocket that presents different environmental concerns, you really have a disconnect between the environmental review that was done and where we are right now. So the two particular concerns about small rockets is, number one, that they fail at a higher rate. The initial environmental review that looked at medium rockets said that between 2% and 7% of those launches would fail. The application for a small rocket facility said that up to 20% of those launches could fail. So we're talking about several times over that this is a riskier type of launch vehicle. The second thing is the concern is that with these rocket failures, you could trigger a wildfire on one of the barrier islands like Cumberland or Little Cumberland Island. Now those islands don't have a fire department. They don't have the infrastructure to easily respond if a wildfire were to start. And so the idea that you might have failure-prone rockets being launched over these areas that are heavily vegetated, that have these coastal winds, the concern is that those fires could escalate quickly and you don't have an adequate way to respond to them. So there really are different concerns that are presented by small rockets that haven't been thoroughly evaluated by the Federal Aviation Administration. Nonetheless, they're moving forward and moving towards a final decision, and the Coastal Consistency Review, this state opportunity to weigh in, is one of the final steps before the Federal Aviation Administration makes a final decision on this project. So turning to the image that hopefully is on your screen right now, you will see in blue, you see the outline of the launch site, and where there's that small black X, that would be the actual point from which rockets are launched. And they are proposing to launch these rockets in a range of trajectories, anything between 83 degrees and 115 degrees. And that just depends on where they want to launch the rocket and how they want it to get into orbit. In their safety review, they focused on the 100-degree trajectory, which basically is the middle of that yellow wedge. But the plans are that they would have the opportunity to launch rockets at any of those trajectories from 83 to 115 degrees. Can we go to the next slide? So as part of the safety review, the FAA requires an applicant for a license to model what would happen if a rocket fails. And so they do a statistical model, and they basically run the same modeling over and over and over a number of times to anticipate all the different range, the range of rocket failures that could occur. And what you see here is you see along the 83-degree trajectory, you see where that model anticipates there could be either explosive impacts, which are in yellow, or inert impacts. Inert would be something like debris falling from the sky. Now, this is not to say that everywhere you see a dot, that there necessarily would be explosive impacts or inert impacts if there's a failure. This is if you imagined 1,000 or 10,000 failures, statistically, where would you be likely to see those impacts? So this is not all, one failure would not result in all of these, but statistically, this is the range of what you would expect and where you're most likely to see those effects. And you're likely to see the explosive effects starting on the mainland and going eastward out towards Cumberland, Little Cumberland Island. And then you see a lot of white dots as you moved eastwards over the northern tip of Cumberland and Little Cumberland Island. So this gives you a sense of, we don't know exactly where the debris would land, but if you run the modeling, these are the locations where you would anticipate to see it with higher or lower probability. Can we go to the next slide? Again, this gives you a sense of the 100-degree trajectory and where it is with respect to Cumberland and Little Cumberland Island. Now, one of the unique things about this proposal is this is basically unprecedented in that it would launch rockets over areas that have that are populated. So most rockets are launched directly over the ocean or over unpopulated areas, but this one you're launching it over Cumberland Island and Little Cumberland Island, both of which have people on them. And so in order to limit the potential exposure of people to failing rockets and rocket debris, Spaceport Camden is proposing to set up a Coast Guard closure zone. And this basically would prohibit anyone from the public to be in those areas while they're launching rockets. The red dotted lines lay out what those closure zones would be. And these closures, it's not just the moment that they're launching the rocket. In order to completely clear these areas, they would have to implement the closure zones hours in advance and hold them open for the entire time they're launching rockets. They've proposed to launch 12 rockets per year, plus they would have other kind of dress rehearsal events that would also require implementing the closure areas. So the areas that you see in the dotted red line, we're talking about closing them several dozen days per year. They're actually, we don't know exactly how many days and for how long those closures would be implemented. All we know is that these measures are necessary and there's no upper limit on how often or how long these closures would be required. Can we go to the next slide? So this is another map. Again, in the hashed orange, you sort of see the range of trajectories that they're talking about. In the kind of the rose-colored shaded area, you see where those Coast Guard closure areas would be. And then this map shows a number of other features on the map and how those features line up with the closure areas with the launch trajectories. So on the northern end of the island, you see a number of both historic structures, culturally significant properties, and then also private homes. Some of them are older than 50 years, some of them are newer than 50 years, but that gives you a sense of the properties that are on Little Cumberland Island and where those properties are with respect to the launch trajectories that Spaceport Camden seeks to use. Moving further to the south, you start to see some of the features on Cumberland Island. So some of these are historic features, like the first African Baptist church is marked. Others are things like trails. So obviously this is a national seashore and a wilderness area. It's a popular destination and it's used by the public. You see where those trails are. You also see where some of the campgrounds are. Some of the folks participating in this webinar may have visited Cumberland Island and may have stayed at some of those locations. So to see where these closures are and where the launch trajectories are with respect to some of those features that people may be familiar with, this could hopefully orient you about the effects of this project with respect to locations on Cumberland Island. So with that, I will turn it over to the next person.
Thank you so much. My name is Charles McMillan. I'm with Georgia Conservancy, and this is a picture at Todd Creek, which shows you some kind of the characteristic, the border at the property there. So we're looking at those, you can see those sandy high bluffs. So that munitions landfill and some of the industrial remnants of the previous industrial use that are still on the property are in some of the, are up on these high bluffs in this very sandy soil. Just west of the launch facility shown in the previous slides is a large landfill that was from some of the previous plant operations. There's a RCRA, a Resource Conservation and Recovery Act permit that's permit that is operated for that landfill right now. So the county will be taking on some of those responsibilities and has indicated that they're interested in possibly putting this into a brownfield program, but it's weak on, but the application and then the issue that's in the permit and the permit review that's before us with the Coastal Resource Division right now, Federal Consistency Review is a little bit weak on some of those details about how site features like this are going to be managed and mitigated moving forward. There's several steps to permitting. After they get through with this stage, there's still more vehicle rocket permitting that they would need to be doing. Next slide, please, Dottie. The X marks the spot. That's the launch facility, and you're going to see that we're going to use that in several of these maps that we're going to be looking at this evening. Cumberland Island is a very large island. I know that many of the people, I can see from the attendees that many of the people I know that have been there. It's National Seashore to the north is Little Cumberland Island, which is a few thousand acres, which is privately owned and has been in conservation for over 50 years. Interestingly, Little Cumberland is included in the National Seashore boundary. This map shows the habitats on these two islands. This is from an inventory of coastal habitats that Georgia Conservancy, Association of County Commissioners, and the DNR completed a few years ago. Throughout the presentation tonight, we'll return to some of the details to show you the habitats that various birds, where you're going to find various birds and how this project places them in somewhat of a vulnerable, these habitats in a vulnerable position. What's truly remarkable in this overall view is that almost all the habitat on Big Cumberland and Little Cumberland is globally significant. If you look at the NatureServe index for these, and you're going to see some of this in just a moment as we start to look at a little bit of the detailed underneath areas underneath the launch trajectory, they're either G2, which is imperiled at high risk of extinction or elimination due to restricted range, or G3, which is a vulnerable at moderate risk. And of fairly restricted range. And that's one reason that you save places like Cumberland and Little Cumberland. Next slide, please. Going into that a little bit, you can see Christmas Creek, which divides Little Cumberland to the north from Big Cumberland. Again, you have the launch site over there to the left on the X, and you're going to see some of these habitats that occur that are fairly unique in their undisturbed nature on these two islands. Next slide, please. The large green spot that you'll see on the previous is a maritime oak hammock. And then next slide, please. Interestingly, something that you don't see on many of the islands in Georgia at all is intact longleaf pine ecosystem, which is at the northern end. So this is fairly high ground, very close, next slide please, to some of the shore. So you have this is the CO complex part of the community. And Abby's going to kick us off on some of the specifics related to the birds on this particular reach, this particular community, which is on this long reach, the spit, if you will, that goes up north along the north end, extreme north end of Big Cumberland, just under the, no matter the launch trajectory, this habitat's going to be under it. This is along Christmas Creek, on the east side of Christmas Creek, which separates Big Cumberland from Little Cumberland. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Sterling.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for sharing this great information and for the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the shorebirds that depend on Cumberland and Little Cumberland. My name is Abby Sterling, and I work with Manomet, which is a nonprofit that focuses on shorebird conservation, among other things. And I'm based locally here on the coast of Georgia, and I was actually lucky enough to do my graduate research on Little St. Simons, Little Cumberland, and Cumberland Island. So I spent many, many hours tromping about on the beaches and dunes of these places, researching Wilson's plovers and American oyster catchers. Sorry if there is some issues with my microphone. I'm seeing that comment. Is this a little better? I'll try to talk slowly and clearly. Cumberland and Little Cumberland are incredibly important habitats for a variety of wildlife, including shorebirds. These images from the top here, in case you haven't been lucky enough to see these places, really highlight just some of the important features: wide open beaches, dunes with vegetation like the sea oats that Charles was talking about, and then some really important foraging habitats as well. Sand and mud flats where these birds can feed. Here is a shot from Pat Leary, who spends a lot of time documenting shorebirds on Cumberland Island. That he just took, thousands of wintering shorebirds that are using the beaches on Cumberland Island. So we see birds really using these habitats throughout the entire year as a staging spot during migration, spending the winters here, and for nesting. And you can go to the next slide, Daddy. Sorry, there's an animation there. You can go ahead and click all the way through so that it's all up. So this is just a map that shows, again, that habitat that Charles was talking about, that spit of land. And this is an old map. This is from 2015. So for those of you familiar with this area, Long Point and Christmas Creek, which divides Cumberland and Little Cumberland, has changed dramatically in the years since this aerial image was taken. But I just wanted to show you the incredible density of nesting Wilson's plovers and oyster catchers that we see here. We know that inlets and the ends of islands are very important for nesting birds. And so both American oyster catchers and Wilson's plovers are considered threatened and rare in the state, and they are high priority species. They're both beach nesting birds. They nest out on open sand in little depressions, scrapes where they lay their eggs. And then they have small precocial chicks that hatch and run around on the beach looking for feeding areas. So these inlets and the back beach areas here that you see on Long Point are incredibly important. And I really don't think there's any place else in the state of Georgia that supports a density of nesting Wilson's plovers like you see in this image here. It is a really important place for them. These birds absolutely need this sort of low disturbance habitat that they find on Long Point and on Little Cumberland. We don't actually even see American oyster catchers nesting in some of the more disturbed places. Additionally, managers on both Cumberland and Little Cumberland have worked really hard to try to increase nesting success for these species. Recently, we've seen American oyster catchers fledging chicks from Cumberland as a result of management efforts. So the folks on these islands are very invested in protecting these places for the nesting shorebirds that depend on them. And you can go to the next one. We know that the coast of Georgia broadly is important for shorebirds throughout the entire year. So it's not just the nesting season. You know, we see birds during migration and then throughout the winter as well. And when we're talking about the numbers of birds that use Cumberland Island, it is probably one of the most significant places for shorebirds in the entire state. You can click again, Dottie. We are a landscape of hemispheric importance for shorebirds, as designated by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which links together all of the important sites that shorebirds need across the entire Western Hemisphere. So the Georgia Barrier Islands were designated in 2017 as the 100th WISRN site. And that designation reflects the numbers of birds that our coast supports. And really those numbers come largely from the populations of shorebirds that are supported on Cumberland Island. You can go to the next one. These awesome pictures come from Pat Leary again. So huge thanks to him. This past spring, we had buff-breasted sandpipers on the Georgia coast, which was really rare and super exciting. This is a photo from Long Point, so right over the place that those rockets would be shooting off. These are some photos that actually he just took in his most recent survey of Cumberland, showing how important this is throughout the winter. He counted 49 piping plovers on Cumberland Island, which is a really huge number of piping plovers. A lot of these individuals are banded, so we know where they come from, and we see significant numbers of federally endangered piping plovers that breed up in the Great Lakes, coming through Cumberland during their migration or spending the entire winter with us. And a huge flock, about 300 red knots, but we're talking about some of the most significant numbers of semi-palmated plovers, huge numbers of dunlins, thousands and thousands of shorebirds using Cumberland Island every single winter. We can go to the next one. And this is one thing that I just wanted to bring up is some of the risks that these birds are facing. This is not a story without precedent. So we have a great example with friends in Texas who are dealing with some really significant implications that are coming out of the SpaceX facility at Boca Chica. And Boca Chica is, and this site where you see this rocket explosion, this is a rocket test failure that happened just at the beginning of February, I believe. And so this is a SpaceX facility that's being used for testing. But the land around this rocket launch site is not a wasteland. It's actually part of the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge and Boca Chica State Park. And it's really significant habitat for a variety of unique wildlife and provides recreational opportunities as well. And so shorebird biologists and other folks have been working really hard to try to rein in some of the activities that are happening here, but they're seeing a huge number of failures and some really significant issues with contamination. You can click one more. This photo is particularly meaningful to me because it's a piece of rocket debris on a really beautiful flat where plovers are trying to nest. And you can see that they've brought in heavy machinery to pick up the debris. So that's one thing to think about, is not just something falling out of the sky and accidentally landing on a bird. It's what it would take to clean up any kind of debris in a sensitive, ecologically important area like Long Point on Cumberland Island or on Little Cumberland Island. And then you can go to the next slide, Dottie. It's not just the beaches here where the shorebirds are depending on Little Cumberland and Cumberland Island. There's also shell rakes all the way along the edges of the Satilla. There's Saltmarsh Island, which is a really important nesting site for brown pelicans and great egrets. A lot of really sensitive areas for shorebirds and other species in this whole area. So I will wrap up my section here and hand the screen over to Adam, but that's just a bit of a background on what we might be looking at for shorebirds in this region.
Great, thank you so much, Abby. Good evening, everyone. This is Adam from Georgia Audubon. I first want to thank my colleagues here who started things off and laid such a fantastic groundwork on, I mean, hopefully from Brian's part alone, you realize why there's some serious issues with this project for habitat, for the people who live on Little Cumberland and Cumberland, and of course now for the shorebirds. This kind of came about because of a conversation we saw on Gabo. I recognize many of the names of the participants tonight, and I know you're birders and you're probably part of the Gabo listserv or active on Facebook. And not the debate, but the conversation about the Camden Spaceport, how it might relate to Merritt Island, pros and cons for birds is kind of what kicked this whole thing off. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about why this place is so special from a bird standpoint, not touching on the shorebirds since Abby did such a great job already. And then talking about some of the issues that Brian and Charles laid out and some of the habitats and how it specifically may affect birds, and then a few other issues as well. So, I mean, Abby just mentioned how fantastic Cumberland is for shorebirds, and it extends well beyond our sandpipers and plovers. Around 300 different species of birds have been seen on Cumberland. I think the eBird checklist have it up where in the 280s. It's just an amazingly diverse spot for our breeding, overwintering, and migratory species. Not only is it a WISRN designated area or part of the Georgia Bight WISRN designated area, it's also a globally recognized important bird area by National Audubon. So it's recognized for being so valuable. On top of that, if you think about the guiding documents for our Georgia Department of Natural Resources, they have a state wildlife action plan and certain species and habitats that kind of guide their work and that they're focused on coming up with strategies to conserve. And the most recent SWAP, that action plan, there are 40 birds that are highlighted as species of special concern that they feel we need to work on conserving. And 30 of those 40 have been detected on Cumberland Island. I mean, a few of those might be an odd, golden-winged warbler here or there, but in general, a vast majority of those critically important species to our state occur to some extent on Cumberland Island. And they also mentioned the habitats or parts of our state that are so crucial for bird conservation, with the barrier islands being one of those focal areas. And of course, with Cumberland being our largest barrier island, with those amazing ancient maritime forests that Charles mentioned, the pine stands, the palmettos, let alone the beaches and the dunes, it's obvious why it's so valuable for birds. And again, it's year round. We talked about, Abby just mentioned these amazing shorebirds that are doing this hemispheric migration that use the island, as well as those that breed there, like Wilson's plovers and oyster catchers. So it's a fantastic spot for birds and somewhere we need to protect. Next, Dottie. So some of those 30 species that I mentioned that are not shorebirds would include the wood stork, a bird that's threatened in the United States. It used to be endangered until less than 10 years ago. And we have some great breeding colonies of wood storks across our coast. But they're a common species that relies on Cumberland and Little Cumberland. And as Abby just mentioned, there's brown pelicans nesting, there's other rookeries. The areas in and around Cumberland and Little Cumberland are crucial for these wading birds. Go ahead, Dottie. And that would also include the tricolored heron. That's another bird that's going to nest down there or that utilizes these spaces. A bird that is somewhat difficult to study, as we're learning here, because they can't be monitored as easily as some of our other white wading birds, because they can't be picked up as easily from aerial surveys. So it's a bird that you can find pretty easily if you go down to the coast, but one that still needs special attention, and one that is a conservation concern and could be impacted by this spaceport should it move forward. Go ahead, Dottie. Now, kind of off the island a little bit, and this is also talking about maybe things of contamination to the water, if there were to be, fuel or other liquid spills, let alone fires. There are many sparrows, specific 3 different sparrows that are really crucial or in crucial urgency of need, including the Saltmarsh Sparrow, which is one of our breeding birds down on the Georgia coast. In addition to the Saltmarsh, we are a great wintering location for Nelson's sparrow, and then Saltmarsh Sparrow, which is a bird of serious conservation concern that some people project could be extinct in most of our lifetimes. So not only do we have these Shorebird habitats, we have these breeding wading bird rookeries. We have birds out in the marsh, like the 3 sparrows I just mentioned, that are all relying on these immediate habitats. Next study. Now, this bird kind of falls into that same realm. This is not one of the swap listed species. If you know what a clapper rail sounds like, you can find them in big numbers down on the Georgia coast. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be protected, or that it isn't going to be affected by any sort of contamination in the marsh that might occur. So it kind of falls in that same category as the sparrows I just mentioned. And they're numerous in between the projected launch pad and the areas that may be affected should a crash or an explosion occur. Next, Dottie. And then this bird is purely from a recreational standpoint. The gray kingbird is a bird that isn't overly uncommon. It's not listed on our swap list. It's common through parts of the Caribbean, but it's a regionally significant bird. If you want to see this bird in the United States, you pretty much have to go to parts of the Gulf Coast or along the Atlantic coast in Florida up to Georgia. And it's a bird that relies on Cumberland and Little Cumberland Island through a couple seasons of the year. And so this is purely more of a bird watching component, to be totally honest. When we go down to the coast, if I'm leading a group of people, we always try to seek out the gray kingbird because it's a special bird. So it might not be of the highest conservation concern, at least compared to the other species I just talked about and those that Abby mentioned. But again, a bird whose habitat deserves to be protected and a bird that will draw visitors to that part of our state. Go ahead, Dottie. And this is an interesting one, and I might be reaching a little bit here, but I want to point it out because it's kind of cool. Kirtland's warblers are the rarest warblers we have here in the United States. And if you know much about them, they breed in the jack pine forest of Michigan and Wisconsin, a little bit into Ontario, and they overwinter strictly to the Bahamas. And in the middle there, this is from a study a few years ago where they put some radio transmitters on some birds. And you can kind of see how southeast Georgia and northeast Florida is that beautiful bluish purple color. And that's showing you that of the birds they tagged, the highest density of those banded birds, when they left the Bahamas, they came to that part of our state. So southeast Georgia is the spot, it appears, for this species. They make landfall there and then they fly up to their breeding grounds in Michigan. This is interesting because if you look to the right, those are the eBird records of Kirtland's warblers. There's 3 and they're all 40 years or older. And I know that DNR biologist Tim Kais has got a couple records of these birds flying past his Modus towers, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that these birds are making landfall on Cumberland somewhat, I won't say frequently, but they are stopping there. If nothing else, they're flying overhead. So this is just another way that this habitat is important for a slew of birds, including these migrants, including these very rare birds. So I don't have a lot of hard data to show that they're stopping on Cumberland, but it's intuitive that they're going from the Bahamas, they're coming down to the southeastern portion of our state, and they're relying on pine stands and live oaks and other good areas to find forage and cover before they fly up to the Midwest for their nesting season. Next slide. So Charles mentioned a few of these exciting habitats, and it's kind of hard to go into specifics when every single one is of global importance. But one that he mentioned is the maritime forest and these amazing views that you get when you go out to Cumberland, if you've been lucky enough to do so. And these areas, again, are loaded with birds, but there are a few groupings of birds that are really easily found in these areas and important. One is the painted bunting, a bird of definite conservation concern. And they love these, kind of dune edges. They'll get down into the palmettos and nest. A very special bird that we find on our Georgia coast that relies on this type of habitat. And then this is just for our transient birds, but if you've been down to Cumberland in migration, especially in fall, it's very likely to get 10, 15 different warbler species in a day. I've been lucky enough to be down there with our friends at the Georgia Ornithological Society leading walks and have a dozen different warblers, like great numbers of black-throated blue warblers that are using these barrier islands to safely get down to the Caribbean. Cape May warblers, American redstarts, Tennessee warblers. So a lot of transient birds need these healthy, intact, robust islands and habitats for them to safely make these journeys. These birds are already operating on the razor's edge of energy resources and dodging many threats, and so they need these rich locations to safely travel. Next slide. And then we also have the pine savannas that Charles mentioned. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there aren't any Bachman sparrows or red-cockaded woodpeckers out there, the birds that you'd associate with longleaf. But there are many more common birds that are still just as important, from pine warblers. The aforementioned Cape May warblers will use pines a lot during migration. But those large kind of significant pine, the collective we've done a lot of work on here in Georgia to bring their numbers back. So they need those large dominant pine trees to nest in, as well as, you know, great horned owls and screech owls. So there's a multitude of critically important habitats on Little Cumberland and Cumberland for the bird population. Next. Go ahead, Doug. Oh, thank you. So Brian did a great job of kind of, there we go, kind of covering this for me earlier, but one of the big issues that could affect not only the homeowners and the people who want to visit these islands, but also the bird life is fire. Now, we know that many of our ecosystems in the Southeast are fire dependent or do benefit from an occasional burn. Now, out on these types of islands, fires would be somewhat frequent, but they would be light, you know, smaller fires caused by lightning. But these larger fires that could be possible, maybe more intense fires from the explosion of a rocket. Not to mention that, as was mentioned earlier, you know, Little Cumberland for sure, and probably Cumberland doesn't have the infrastructure to combat these fires. So if you did have an extreme fire, it might kill that understory to the point where they can't come back, even though it is a fire, a species that does well in fire, the palmettos, for example. So fire can definitely have a negative impact on the habitat of these islands, and then of course of the birds that rely on them to be there and to be healthy. So it also could have you know, threats to recreation. We talked about where the trails are. We talked about the potential of the campgrounds being under the flightway of these rockets. So fire could definitely have a negative impact on the habitat at large, the birds, and then the people who want to use these spaces. Next, Dottie. So this is maybe something you haven't thought of. If you've listened to me talk the past couple of years, you know that I care quite a bit about bird collisions. And one thing that drives collisions is nocturnal lighting. So many of our songbirds, all those warblers I just mentioned, red-eyed vireos, which are down there in great numbers, most of them migrate at night. And when they come across an illuminated city or structure, they are confused and often attracted to those light sources. And that can lead to collisions with an illuminated structure, or again, them wasting that vital energy that they need when they're migrating. Go ahead, next, Dottie. But you might be saying, Adam, that's Atlanta. We're talking about one little structure down there. That's not going to, you know, kill thousands and thousands of birds. But I wanted to show you these two because it's not just a big urban city type problem. This is a relatively boring building in Galveston, Texas, that on one night a couple years ago killed 500 birds. And then at the University of the South up in Tennessee, that cross is illuminated at night. There's no way that this spaceport is smaller than that cross, and they had 150 birds die at that structure in one evening. So I can't say for sure what's going to happen, but we know that that rocket launch, that facility is going to be illuminated, and it's going to negatively impact to some extent all those amazing migrating warblers that are using our coastline to head north in under a month. They're going to be coming up. So hypothetically, if it was already constructed, it could be posing a threat on those black-footed blue warblers in summer temperatures. Next, Dottie. And so I wanted to mention Merritt Island because this was something that was specifically brought up. You can go back one, Dottie, if you don't mind. That was specifically, excuse me, brought up in our conversation online about the reserve and about Merritt Island being such a great birding location. There we go. Merritt Island, if you're not familiar, it's on the Atlantic coast of Florida near Titusville, just north of Cocoa Beach. There's 140,000 acres in this wildlife refuge, and it was acquired by NASA back in the 60s. And it is kind of immediately adjacent to the launch pad there, the Kennedy Space Center Space Shuttle area. And it's a famous bird watching destination. They have the Space Coast Birding Festival there that has a huge generator for the local economy. And it's one of my favorite bird watching places ever. I love going there, and it has many great reasons to go there. Next, Dottie. And these are just from my trip there in January when I went down there with Georgia Audubon. Many of the exciting birds you can also find on Cumberland. Pretty much just ignore that scrub jay in the bottom left, and these are all birds of the Georgia coast. And so it is a fantastic spot, and some of that habitat, or a lot of it, was preserved by NASA purchasing it. It's also a marshy area that was unlikely to be developed. Go ahead, next, Dottie. However, this is not the same as what we're talking about here for Spaceport Camden. First, as Brian laid out, the flight pattern of these rockets. At Merritt Island, these rockets are going out over the ocean. This would be very different, where it's posing all these issues to the barrier islands that we have in its flight path. From what I've been told, the fate of this land is not Spaceport Camden or a large development, especially because of the contamination. And my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but it wouldn't be helping or preserving habitat as we saw in the Merritt Island example. That benefit would not be occurring at this location. We already have these amazing protected barrier islands. So that's one major distinction. Another thing is there were some negatives to the space shuttle area in Merritt Island. It might not have been because of rocket failure, but the dusky seaside sparrow was pushed to extinction in that area because of secondary changes that were needed to be made to the wetland habitat around the launch pad. So it's not all perfect down there, even though it is a fantastic birding destination. And as we've already touched on, it could hurt visitation, limit recreation, and there's a lot of people out to Cumberland and Little Cumberland and lots of birders specifically, many of which are on this call. Go ahead, next, Dottie. And so this is my kind of big picture end here. Many of you have probably noticed in your lifetime the decrease in birds that we've seen in our country, and you probably know about this study that came out just a couple years ago that shows that we've lost 2.9 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's not 2.9 billion individuals, it's the collective number of birds in our country at one time has gone down by almost 3 billion, almost 30%. And many of these are our common birds, but also the coastal birds have been hit hard. Aerial insectivores like barn swallows, a bird that's all over Georgia, but they're crashing. And a bird that you can absolutely find flying down the beaches of Cumberland Island when you're there during migration. And forest birds, like all these at trying to make the most of a backyard or of an urban green space. And Abby's working so hard to lower disturbance. We have to maximize the most we have of these habitats. We have to all be engaged and interested in protecting these birds for their sake and for ours. And we can't go away by threatening something as valuable as our largest barrier island in a place that's so resourceful for all of our birds and so crucial. So that's my big picture plea on why, if Cumberland were to be drastically affected, population level changes of things may not occur, but we need to protect places like this and keep them safe for wildlife. That's the end of my section. I think we're going to kick it back to Brian so he can kind of cover maybe the action items, and I think maybe Charles has one more slide as well. So thank you.
For everybody, this is a map of Cumberland Island, and I believe Dottie's going to put the link to download this map. This is something that Georgia Conservancy put together a few years ago, and when you're over there, you can marry up these habitats with this map and hike to your heart's content. But the map is downloadable, and we thought that you guys would enjoy having that.
So this is to sort of summarize where we are in the process and the reason for doing this presentation tonight. So the Georgia Coastal Resources Division is currently evaluating this project, and they will make a decision on whether to certify that this proposal is consistent or object to this proposal under the Georgia Coastal Management Program. So if you want more information about the project, you can go to the CRD website. The address is there for you. We'd like to encourage you to submit comments. Obviously, we've hopefully from the material presented tonight, you agree with us that this is something that Georgia should not be certifying as consistent, but instead should be objecting to. But if you should submit whatever comment you believe is appropriate. You can do that. The easiest way to do that is by email. So the email address for submitting comments is there. If you put Spaceport Camden or Camden Coastal Consistency in the subject line, they'll put it in the right place. If you prefer to do it by regular mail, there's the mailing address as well. The deadline to comment is March 8th. So that's Monday. So you have a little bit of time, not a whole lot of time, but a couple days in the weekend to get your comments in. So again, if you want more information, you can go to the website. There's the draft environmental impact statement. There's a variety of other documents. There's the Georgia Coastal Resources, the Coastal Management Plan is available there. So all the information you need is there. Email address, a reminder, deadline is March 8th, next Monday.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And thanks very much to Charles and Brian and Abby for joining us and giving us a broader perspective on this issue. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I'm going to pose them now, and I'll let you, if you feel like you've got the answer, then please just weigh in unless they're specifically addressed to somebody. Somebody says that the applicable jargon in the CRD review for CCC determination is the Coastal Management Program, not plan, and cautions that we need to be careful not to confuse the two completely different documents. Anybody have any comments on that, or just?
I guess I'll just add that I think the most important thing for the people on the call is to have their voice be heard, and I wouldn't get caught up in, there's no magic language, right? So,
Okay.
The most important thing is to use your voice and tell the Coastal Resources Division what you think, and don't feel intimidated by, kind of wading into all the process and the terminology. The most important thing is to weigh in and tell them what you think.
Somebody asks if there are any studies to show the impact on the Boca Chica site that it's had on area birds.
Yeah, I actually, sorry that I clicked answer live. I meant to type an answer and did not do that. There is potentially the opportunity to have results from looking at how birds are changing their use of the site of Boca Chica. David Newstead, who is a shorebird biologist and director of the Coastal Bird Program, the Coastal Bend, Bays, and Estuaries Program, has been doing some studies with telemetry on birds, but he said anecdotally he's at least seen decreased use probably because of the disturbance, but nothing has been validated yet, so it's in progress.
Right. Paula asks, and I think Adam may have covered this, but how the Kennedy Space Center affects birds on Merritt Island, and is the project worse than Kennedy? But I think Adam kind of covered that in his remarks.
Yeah, I think so as well. I don't know if I have much else to add. It's different. I do think it is potentially worse. But yeah, if Paula has more specific questions or follow-ups, I'm happy to try to tackle them.
Brian, since the FAA plans now to issue the FEIS without further comment, it seems the only next chance to influence the project is when they have to get the environmental review for the launch permit application. Can you comment on that? After you unmute.
See that I'm unmute. We have an opportunity right now to weigh in as part of the coastal consistency review. So that's one step in the process, and they have stated what their current plan is, but those plans can certainly change. And so again, I think the most important thing is to participate in the process and the opportunity that we have right now.
Has the environmental impact study also reviewed the impact of toxic rocket exhaust?
I don't recall seeing that issue, but the environmental impact statement is several hundred pages long, so it's possible that I've missed that, but I don't think that was one of the issues that was addressed in that document.
This is Charles. I believe there was an air quality certification, or at least an air quality. There was an element of it that dealt with air quality, I believe, and in some of the thick stuff, but probably not a detailed model.
Can anybody suggest places where we can find information on the effects on aquatic life like turkey, dolphin, right whales, etc.?
Some of that information is covered in the draft environmental impact statement, and that document is available on the website that we put up the address for before. If you go into that document, it'll have sections related to different kinds of species. And so you can see the extent to which they've considered some of these effects and the extent to which they maybe haven't.
Somebody asks, they said they understand that Camden County plans to use the protected salt marsh as a buffer for the spaceport, and asks, do they have the right to do that?
So let me sort of explain what's happening here. So one of the FAA requirements is that you need a certain distance between the launch site and what they call the site boundary. So normally you would assume that the site boundary is the property line. But in this case, that distance extends off the upland and into the coastal marsh, and actually includes part of the Satilla River and Todd Creek and a couple of other waterways that are around there. And so, you know, that to me seems inconsistent with the way the FAA regulation reads. The FAA hasn't weighed in to clarify this particular issue, but this seems like something that's very appropriate to raise with the Coastal Resources Division about how are we allowing our Georgia coastal marshlands to be used, and do we want them to be the technical term for that measurement, that distance, is the debris dispersion radius. That's basically the area that we're setting aside to catch rocket debris. Is that really how we want our Georgia coastal marshlands to be used?
Here's a good one. Is there really another need for another spaceport?
So in evaluating this project, the FAA doesn't look at whether there's actual need. They're evaluating this because Camden County has proposed it. So the FAA in the past has issued licenses for spaceports that were never built because there's not market demand for it, but someone decided to submit an application anyway. And so, you know, if you look at other spaceports around the country, they're not operating at capacity. And I think there are legitimate questions about, even if they could get a license, would anyone want to build a spaceport here and want to launch rockets here? But certainly we prefer they don't issue a license in the first instance. But part of their, you know, they review the environmental effects, they review the safety, they don't review whether there's actually need.
Sorry, lots of questions in both chat and Q&A. What is the relation between the hazard zones and the areas to be evacuated at time of launch? Presuming that the evacuation areas are much larger due to navigational areas potentially caused by failed launches.
So this gets a little bit into the finer points of the FAA regulations. Basically, there are certain areas where you cannot have people present under any circumstances, and those areas are very close to the launch site. But then there are larger areas where people can be present, you just have to show that there's a statistically small enough likelihood that they would be injured if a rocket fails. So you have these larger areas where you could have one person as long as there's a 1 in a million chance that that person would be injured. But then there are other areas where you can't have any people at all. And so I think that's sort of the difference between the Coast Guard closure area, which is very large, and then there's a much smaller area called the overflight exclusion zone, and that's an area where people cannot be present during launches at all.
Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have a say in the approval process?
So the Fish and Wildlife Service was consulted as part of under the Endangered Species Act. They were required to consult on this project, and those comments are part of the draft environmental impact statement. Now, the concerns about wildfire have really emerged subsequent to that document. So I think that that's an area where I'm not sure that the Fish and Wildlife Service has really thought about what the effects of wildfire would be if a launch failure were to trigger wildfire and change the habitat in some of the ways that Adam was talking about.
Are there any changes in the area since the initial application was made?
I'm not sure how to answer this question. I mean, you know, the particular project site, I don't think that has changed substantially. But obviously, when you look at what's happened on Cumberland or Little Cumberland or anywhere else in the sort of the lower Satilla Basin, I think certainly there are different things that have changed.
Is the spaceport being developed and managed by a government agency, or is it totally private? And where are other nearby spaceports located?
So the spaceport is being proposed by Camden County, by the county government. It's not being proposed by the FAA. It's not being proposed by NASA. It's not being proposed by SpaceX or any of the other companies. It's being proposed by the county. Now the county envisions once they get a license, they will partner with some private company to operate it, but that private company hasn't been identified yet. So right now, this is basically Camden County trying to get into the space game.
Would campers on Cumberland Island be in potential danger?
I wouldn't want to be camping at one of those sites if they were launching rockets over my head.
Okay, launches get scrubbed and rescheduled all the time. Does that mean that the Coast Guard exclusion zone could end up being closed way more than the 12 launches for which Camden is applying?
That's an excellent point. I mean, the fact of the matter is they've talked about 12 launches and they talk about other closures that might be required when you do a dress rehearsal or something else. But if you have thunderstorms in the area, the launch that was supposed to happen on Sunday may not happen on Sunday, and maybe they have to close those same areas on Monday and hope the weather clears, and then maybe they close them again on Tuesday. This certainly happens elsewhere, and I think these are real concerns about what it looks like for people who want to access the park, people who are trying to travel up and down the intercoastal waterway, people who are trying to, you know, you have shrimpers and fishermen who are trying to use the area, and I think there are real concerns about what it looks like to have these massive closure areas and the effects it'll have on recreation and navigation and anyone else who's really trying to use this area.
Somebody asks, how much scope drift is there? Does there tend to be once a project like this is completed?
So I think it's interesting to talk about Boca Chica and the FAA's process. So the FAA, they have sort of a two-step process where right now what they're doing is they're licensing the launch site, basically the launch pad. And then in the future, they'll come back, and for each launch of a rocket, they'll issue a license for that individual rocket. Okay. So right now we're just looking at the launch pad, and later we'll come back and evaluate the safety of an individual rocket launch. The problem with this is that to get the license for a launch site, you only have to show that there's one possible scenario where you can safely launch a rocket. So what the applicants do is they make all the safest assumption about the size of the rocket and the trajectory and the payload, you know, the safest possible scenario. If they can make those numbers work, the FAA will issue them a launch license. But then inevitably what happens is they want to launch rockets that don't look like that safest possible scenario. They want to launch something that's maybe a little bit bigger, or maybe it has a little bit less thrust, or it has a different payload. And so that's when you get into concerns about, we've now licensed a launch site, but we want to do something that's different than what we talked about when we licensed that site. And that's exactly what's happened at Boca Chica. So they issued a license for one type of rocket, and now SpaceX says, well, actually, we want to launch different types of rockets. And so that puts the FAA in the position of saying, well, we allowed you to build this facility, but now you're telling us you can't use it because you want to launch something else. It's really an untenable position for the FAA to come back and say, well, we're not going to allow you to do that. So I think there's a real risk of scope drift here, because you're issuing a license with the safest possible scenario, but in all likelihood, you're going to end up with something that is not as safe as what you evaluated when you licensed the launch site to begin with. So there's really, you know, pick your analogy, you know, crack the door, the camel's nose under the tent. I mean, pick your sort of analogy here, but there are concerns that if we license this for anything, they'll come back and try to launch things that are less safe than what they're talking about right now.
Has anybody talked about new land acquisitions nearby, and what would the status of those be?
Right. So someone just asked me a moment ago if there have been any changes in the area. Two of the changes that have happened since the draft environmental impact statement is that large parcels of property have been transferred to Georgia DNR to be operated as wildlife management areas. So there's the Ceylon track, which is immediately to the west of this. And then there's also the Cabin Bluff tract, which is immediately to the south of this. And both of those have been taken from private hands into public hands to be operated as wildlife management areas. And so this is a good thing. We want to be preserving these areas. And these are actually really important areas because they're large coastal tracts that are still undeveloped. But no one has evaluated what it's going to look like to operate a spaceport literally right next door. So if you do have a rocket go off course, if you have a wildfire, if you have even the noise and the vibration, no one's really thought about what that looks like for the animals that might be trying to use these wildlife management areas.
Would the spaceport affect the nearby Kings Bay Naval Base, and do they have any say or concerns about the development? There's
been an extended back and forth between the Navy and the proponents of Spaceport Camden about exactly what they would do and how they would do it. We've been trying to get these documents through Freedom of Information Act requests, so we're sort of a little bit we're kind of behind where those conversations currently are. But I can say that the Navy has been asking an awful lot of questions about how exactly this is going to work and how it might potentially impact the operations on the base, but also the safety of their personnel who are stationed there.
If the license is approved, is there an expiration date by which they must build the spaceport?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head.
And is there the threat of adding another launch pad?
As I said earlier, they're issuing a license for what they've currently proposed. The concern is that this may lead to something else. So certainly that could be another launch pad. It could be different types of rockets. It could be larger rockets or more launches. I think the risk here is that once this is established as a spaceport, once we've made all these accommodations, that Spaceport Camden will come back and try to do things that are different than what they're talking about right now. And certainly a second launch pad is not my primary concern, but I don't think it's impossible either.
Well, that about wraps up the questions. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brian and Charles and Abby and Adam for joining us. And I will be downloading this presentation, and we will have a recording posted on our YouTube channel within a day or so. And I can also download the Q&A in the chat and send it out to registered participants with the with questions and answers that came in. Thanks everybody for attending, and keep your eyes on your email for links to those aforementioned things, and y'all have a good evening.
Send in a comment. Yeah.
Well,
Write a letter.
write a letter, please.
Submit your comments.